my PowerPoint presentation. And let's see. Okay, my question for you as we begin. When did the nuclear crisis in Korea begin? And if you are John Kim or Subok Kim, you cannot answer this question. But for other people, when did this begin?
1950, during the Korean War.
Subok.
What did I just say? If you are Subok Kim, you cannot answer this question. So yes, and Subok is correct. So the nuclear crisis, the main point here that's important is that the nuclear crisis actually began during the Korean War, right? When the US threatened to use nuclear weapons. General MacArthur recommended the use of nuclear weapons in Korea. Truman publicly confirmed that it's always been their consideration to use them. And also he granted authority to the UN commander-in-chief, the UN command, so-called UN commander-in-chief to use nuclear weapons. And then after the Korean War, the US actually deployed hundreds of tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea, as many as 950 nuclear warheads at one point. And this is a clear violation of the Armistice Agreement. And then, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, North Korea found itself to be very much alone in a world that is dominated by US global capital. And North Korea wanted to actually normalize relations with the United States. And when it was accused of having nuclear weapons, North Korea said, okay, we want to talk to the US directly, and we will tell you if we have nuclear weapons or not when we meet with the US directly. And the US refused. And the Clinton administration actually came very close to militarily attacking North Korea. It was only averted when Jimmy Carter went to North Korea at the 11th hour, negotiated with Kim Jong-il what we call the agreed framework. And this is sort of the defining thing of the Clinton administration. So when people talk about, nuclear issue, Clinton administration, we have to know the agreed framework. That was the first major agreement between North Korea and the US on its nuclear weapons. And the main components of the agreement were that North Korea would freeze and then eventually dismantle its nuclear infrastructure. In exchange, the US would give energy aid and build 2 light water reactors. Both parties would move towards normalizing relations. So it was a historic agreement. And from 1994 to 2002, until the next administration, North Korea actually followed through and froze its plutonium production. Unfortunately, the US did not keep its promise because the dominant thinking in Washington was that, North Korea is going to collapse very soon. So we should not have to follow through on these agreements. The next administration was Bush, as you'll remember, and he basically did not want to abide by any agreement signed with North Korea, accused the North Koreans of being part of the axis of evil, and openly talked about regime change and collapse. So in 2003, North Korea withdrew from the NPT, kicked out all of the international inspectors, and then restarted its plutonium program. The defining feature of this administration was the 6-party talks. Basically, China became very nervous, with this state, the relations between the US and North Korea deteriorating, there actually could be a war. So China actually proposed, hey, let's bring all the parties together in these negotiations. So the 6-party talks went on for a few years. And then again, they came up with an agreement that was exactly the same as what they had come up with before in the agreed framework. And again, North Korea followed through on its responsibilities. And in this time, what the US did actually move the goalpost of the agreement. So they introduced new demands that were not part of the original agreement. North Korea detonated a nuclear weapon in response, and then the US tightened sanctions. The following administration was Obama, and the defining feature of his policy was what they called strategic patience, which basically means they're going to just keep up pressure mainly through sanctions, and then militarily prepare for North Korea's collapse. So they had all these war plans. The Pentagon had these war plans that were imagining like 7 different scenarios for North Korea's collapse, and then how would the military move in to occupy North Korea. So they had all these plans. So that was about, not much happened in terms of negotiation during Obama's administration. And then, as we know, the last administration, the defining feature was the Singapore Agreement. And here again, they agreed, let's normalize relations, establish a peace regime, denuclearize the peninsula. Of course, that agreement didn't go anywhere because the talks then soon broke down in Hanoi. And Bolton brought all these new demands about North Korea's unilateral disarmament. So I think the main point here is that each time there was a breakthrough towards some sort of a peace agreement between the two parties, there was some force in Washington that tried to undermine those negotiations. And this was true in both the Democrat and Republican administrations. Now, in the current moment, we're in another stalemate. North Korea has said many times, we will only, we're done talking. We don't want to repeat this pattern anymore. We will only meet with the US if the US drops its hostile policy. And in its last statement by I believe it was the foreign ministry statement, they were very specific about what they mean by hostile policy. And the US keeps repeating the same mantra: we're willing to meet with North Korea anytime without preconditions. What it has not said, though, is it willing to drop its hostile policy and follow through on past agreements? So that is the current stalemate right now. What we have always said and will continue to say is that the root of this conflict, the nuclear issue, the so-called, is the unresolved Korean War. And resolving it is key to de-escalating the nuclear standoff, and then creating trust and space for further negotiations. So a peace agreement is key. It would reduce the risk of an intentional nuclear escalation or even an accidental nuclear escalation. And this last point is sometimes important because, people in Washington will say to you, well, is negotiating a peace agreement with North Korea, does that mean that we're recognizing them as a nuclear weapon state? Because we don't want to do that. And we can just say, no, well, legally, no, it does not, because the NPT is pretty clear on this. It says only states that detonate a nuclear weapon prior to 1967 is considered a nuclear weapon state. So, we don't have to recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state to negotiate a peace agreement. The last thing I'll say before I open up for question is some resources. So if you want to read up more on this, there are 3 resources that I'd like to point you to. The first is the Path to Peace report, the case for a peace agreement to end the Korean War. It's a very lengthy report, and it looks like this. But there is an entire chapter dedicated to this issue, and it goes into very much detail about the legality and the history. So it's a good resource if you have the time to look through it. If you don't have the time to look through it, we took the time to create a 1-page brief on that chapter. So that is another resource. I'll put all of these links in the chat later so you have it. And then the final resource I would like to point you to is this brochure that we created in 2017 or 18, frequently asked questions on peace in Korea. So, all the questions that we ever get, how can we trust Kim Jong-un, or, can we trust North Korea as a negotiating partner? We get these questions a lot. So, there are some suggested responses there. That's it. I'll stop there. I don't know how much time we have for questions. Turn it over to Sally.
Well, that's great. You can go to gallery view so we can see all of ourselves. And if you have a question, you can just, speak out, or if you want to raise your hand, we'll also check the chat. Can I start with a question? Because I got a chance to look at your material before, and I think that very few people really know that history. I feel like we're working against propaganda really on the US side over many, many years that is villainized North Korea or made the North Korean leaders appear irrational. And so when we are talking to our Congress members, those members have been subjected to that message for the last 70 years or something like that. So it's like, we can talk about facts and we can talk about this timeline, but it doesn't break through that 70 years of propaganda. And there was a little bit of breakthrough, I thought, with the Olympics, when the Olympics happened and the North Koreans and the South Koreans came together, and there was like that sort of broke through some of that. But how do you break through that 70 years of propaganda that, as living in the United States, we've been subjected to? How do we break through that? Even with facts, we can tell them the facts, but that won't dispel that. That's my question.
It's not easy, as you know. We run up against it all the time, not just with people in Congress, just everyday people. And I think the best way to break through it is through their hearts, by telling our personal stories, especially for Korean Americans to say, hey, I want peace in Korea because my family is there, or my family has lived through the war, or I have family in North Korea, whatever it may be. We need peace in Korea, and the personal story is what is eventually going to move people, I think. The facts, I think you're right, it's dry. It's sometimes they might roll their eyes and say, I've heard this all before, and it goes over their head. And I think the strength of the personal story is that it moves their hearts. And then for people who are not Korean also, we need to talk about, hey, we just said we're weeding off endless wars, and here is a war that's been going on for 71 years. Isn't it time to end it? 71 years is a long time. There must be a way to end it. Yeah.
And we have Sobak and Young with questions. So Sobak, just unmute and go ahead.
Okay, thank you. It's a great briefing. Thank you, Hyun. And you mentioned that their goal, their post moved. My question is, from where to where moved? Could you explain?
What do you mean move?
In your briefing, the USA, I believe, moved negotiation goalpost.
Oh, yeah, that really gets into the weeds, but this is referring to the Bush administration, the six-party talks. At the end of the six-party talks, they came up with an agreement. And there were 3 phases to implement the agreement. And in the second phase, North Korea was supposed to declare, which means create a report of all of its nuclear activities and deliver it to the US, to international inspectors. And it did that. It delivered like thousands, tens of thousands of pages, apparently, of all of its nuclear activities. And then the third phase was supposed to be verification, but the US actually demanded verification in the second phase. And the North Koreans said, hey, that's a violation of our sovereignty. You want us to open up all of our facilities for your inspection. No, we're not going to do that. And that's why the talks broke down. And much, much later on, Condoleezza Rice was speaking at the Heritage Foundation and said, we actually did move the goalposts on the North Koreans.
Thank you.
Young, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation and for the documents, Hyun. I was just curious, sort of the research group, what their thoughts were after the very public Afghanistan pullout, how you think that might affect the administration's thinking around changing the status quo with North Korea right now.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I did have some hope around that time, but quickly I realized that it's not going to change much because, as you know, Congress, the House just voted to give the administration, what is it, $770 billion, something enormous for the defense budget, right? And there seems to be bipartisan consensus in Washington about China as the new enemy. And so that's very alarming, especially for Korea, which is right in that region and caught up in the whole US-China contest. And then it's pretty clear to me that the Biden administration is not budging on its Korea policy, which is really the same policies we've seen the past 25 years, sanctions, military exercises, keep up the pressure by talking about human rights, isolate North Korea, that sort of thing.
Maud, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you, Hyun, for this presentation and also for sending it to us in written form, because it's really hard to keep track of the different negotiations sometimes. And it's, I think it's particularly unclear to legislators a lot of times, or just the general public, that the US has welched on its commitments in these negotiations. So they're always blaming North Korea for not following through, but they are totally ignorant of the US side of it. So this is great documentation. I was sort of interested in a little more of your thinking about how to deal with the China issue. It just seems to me that it's, it's important in and of itself for the US not to be escalating military tensions with China, but also it's having a terrible impact, I imagine, on getting any good negotiations going on North Korea.
You're so right.
What are your suggestions?
My gosh, that is the $1 million question for all peace activists in the US right now, because that's where everything is headed, right? It's a windfall again for defense contractors. And, after pulling out of Afghanistan, withdrawing from the Middle East, no time to critically reflect like what that was all about and how we got in there the first place. I feel like we're repeating the same exact thing again. Everybody automatically assumes China is the new enemy. Nobody stops to question, are they really, and why? And so I think it's really like, I love Code Pink's campaign, China is not our enemy. I think, I really do think that we're behind the curve, we need to be coming together, the peace and anti-war movement in the US around this, and pushing back against, media assumptions, Congress, what's happening in Congress, and what the administration is doing to move in that direction. I'll just tell you one anecdote, even though we don't have a whole lot of time. Last summer, it was the middle of the pandemic, it's a super hot summer, and I was like, oh, I don't want to do any work, but how can I be productive? And so I actually took a very expensive course with CSIS. As you know, it's like a defense industry funded think tank in Washington, DC. And they have this course annually about the defense industry. And I was like, oh, I want to learn about this. So I took it. And Kathleen Hicks was one of the main instructors. She's now Deputy Defense Secretary. And it was very clear from that course, in which direction that this country was going to be headed in. And our tabletop exercise was actually, how would you come up with the defense budget when you have all these different challenges in the world, and what would be your priorities? And it was very clear to me in that course that one, there's a lot of money at stake for defense contractors. They really felt that this, increased call for cutting the defense budget among the US public was a threat, and that it was very important with the new administration to move very quickly to convince the US public that we have a new enemy and that it's important to shift to Asia. And that's exactly what we're seeing unfolding right now. So, and that's going to be a challenge for all of us, moving forward. And we do really need to come together. I'm sorry, I don't have concrete answers, but, I agree with you. It is a priority for us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Maud. Are there any more questions? I know that there's some people who have to leave at 7, but I want to make sure this was just a really a great opportunity for us to talk to somebody who really knows this material. So if you have another question, now's the time. If there was something in the chat and I missed it, just spit it out.
I just have a small question. Hyun's outline said that Jimmy Carter went to North Korea without Clinton's permission, and I was wondering how that came about. I mean, I lived through it, but I don't remember how he happened to go. Of course, now he's 97 or something. It's too bad that.
There might be other people like John Kim here who are more familiar with exactly that, but a good resource I just put in the chat is this book called Meltdown by Mike Chinoy. And he was a CNN reporter who actually traveled to North Korea with Jimmy Carter in 1994. And he chronicles the nuclear negotiations, all of what happened and how it broke down. And it's a page turner too. It's a really good book. I recommend it.
Okay, thanks.
I have another question for you, Hyun. Where in the peace movement, there is a work to try to bring shine a light on all the sanctions that have been imposed on countries around the world. North Korea, Cuba, and many others, of course, Venezuela. I was wondering if there's so many things going on in the world. How do we integrate the work that we're doing on Korea with all those other movements to shine a light on sanctions don't work? And is there a way for us to sort of raise the profile of the work that we're doing in conjunction with a coalition of other organizations?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and I agree with you that we need to do more of that. Yeah, it's clear that the Korea issue is not going to move in this administration unless other things move, right? So we actually need to be aligned more with broader movements that are critical of the current administration's policies, especially on war, foreign policy, and other issues as well. So, but I don't feel like I have a very good mapping of all the different organizations and coalitions, who's doing what, and how people are organized and how people are moving. But for other folks on this call who are part of other movements, whenever you see like, oh yeah, the Korea work should be aligned with this other thing, please reach out to me or Christine or any one of, or like, let's have a conversation even here about how we can do that better. Because I agree with you, like a single issue right now is not the time where you can actually move a single issue forward.
Yeah. Can I say something? I think this is a definition of insanity. If I have 7,500 somethings and you have none, and you ask me, can I have one? And I say, no, you can't have one, but I can have 7,500. And I wonder why the Korean folks, the North Korean, don't go to either the UN or the World Court and get it out all over the world that we have maybe 5 or 10, and the United States has 7,500. How can that be? And they're the ones that are putting sanctions on us and telling us that we can't have the weapons. Definition of insanity. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly the reason why we should support the nuclear, what is it called? Nuclear ban treaty at the UN, right?
Young?
Yeah, Hyun, thanks so much for this kind of historical and factual fact sheets that we can all use again and again. I didn't want to kind of dilute the subject, but since most of us in this room are not that familiar with the thinking in South Korea, of course, this nuclear issue is basically a thing between the US and North Korea, but especially with the change in administration that will happen next spring, what is the thinking? What changes might there be that we can sort of expect to see?
Yeah, well, no one has a crystal ball right now.
Yeah, but
however, you know, I mean, as with the rest of the world, I think South Korea is a very polarized society right now, politically. There's growing nationalism, but there are also people who are calling for systemic change. And so we have yet to see, but hopefully, you know, we have some good progressive candidates and you know, there will be a, you know, a good outcome in the next presidential election, regardless of what happens in the presidential election. What we saw with the I mean, think back to the beginning of the Moon Jae-in administration, all the hope that we had, all of the change that we thought would happen because it was a progressive president, it did not happen. Not for a lack, not that they didn't try. I think the Moon administration in the beginning especially really tried to engage with the North economically, right? They tried to connect the railways and all of it was shut down because the US didn't want South Korea, quote unquote, to go off the reins, right? And so, you know, if South Korea is going to have any independence in its ability to make its own foreign policy and policy in terms of how it relates to North Korea, it's going to take a broader movement, not just relying on one president's individual. And the broader movement needs to express what the people have been saying all along, which is we don't want to be caught in this, you know, the fight between the US and North Korea or US and China. I mean, it puts South Korea, especially the ordinary people, in a very difficult position, right? I mean, China is important because of its ties to the economy, and you know, being forced to choose sides between the US and China, that's a very difficult predicament for all countries in Asia. And South Korea, especially if there's confrontation between the US and China, God forbid, South Korea is automatically involved by virtue of the fact that it is an ally of the US. So for all of these reasons, I think South Korea has great interests in moving towards independence, in determining its own policies, especially foreign policy, but it's going to take a broader movement, not just relying on the next presidential candidate.